Hello. Hi to everybody joining us in the morning, afternoon, or evening. My name is Robin, and today we'll walk you through the inaugural episode of our new series called The Humans of Testing. Why it's called The Humans of Testing is it is inspired from the Humans of New York project. And the whole idea is that we put focus on the ones who don't get a lot of spotlight, the QAs, the testers, the engineers, the developers, the guys behind the guys talking to the customers. So this is our first one. We are live with Andrew over here.
Hello.
If Andrew can present his screen, we can start looking at the presentation and be on time. That is the first quality of a good tester.
I believe I am sharing my screen right now. So
Yes, got it. Super awesome. So cool. We will get going. Today's topic is something very close to my heart. Salesforce releases, and we reached out to Andrew, and we are very grateful for Andrew to join us and help us with the deep understanding and knowledge of what is new and what really matters the most. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Quick introductions first. So my name is Robin. I'm the co-founder and CEO at TestZeus. I'm also an open source contributor, international speaker at conferences such as Dreamforce, and have authored the book called Ultimate Selenium WebDriver for Test Automation. I come with 15 plus years of experience in the industry, slightly newcomer in that ways as compared to some of the other folks here, but definitely learning every day and definitely loving every day in the Salesforce ecosystem. So that's about me, but it's not about me. On to Andrew.
yeah, thank you, Robin, and once again, thank you for inviting me to join your inaugural session here for your series. So yeah, I am Andy Fawcett. I'm an independent Salesforce consultant. I've had around 15 years in the Salesforce ecosystem, mainly in development and engineering. But I've also been involved at Salesforce and before that in Financial Force in various technical and latterly product leadership roles as well. And I also have a book, Salesforce Platform Enterprise Architecture. It's now in its 4th edition, so it's got a number of years behind it. So what is it that I do in Salesforce, in AndyInTheCloud Consulting? I'm providing architecture and product strategy services. I'm also the creator of DLRS, or Dolores as some people call it, and a number of Apex frameworks. I've been in the ISV industry, ISV ecosystem, before joining Salesforce as part of the Financial Force on our Satania business, one of the first companies to start putting applications of a significant complexity on the App Exchange. These days, I find myself focusing on AI enablement and developer workflows around AI, and of course, focusing, and you'll see through my highlights today, in Salesforce platform architecture. So without further ado, let's get into some of the highlights. And as you have gathered from my background, I'm looking at this from a more developer and architecture perspective. But Robin's going to jump in here and ask me some thoughts from a testing perspective as we go through some of these and just reflect on, well, what does it mean? What do we think about in terms of testing? Is our existing testing techniques applicable, or do we need to invest in other techniques with these new features? So we'll keep that in mind as we go through here. So I split up my thoughts process here between things that are more about integration and API updates. These are kind of things that matter a lot to me, and I think to a lot of customers of Salesforce, because ultimately there's a lot of things that go on inside Salesforce, but a lot of businesses have other services and products that they want to bring into that. So I'm always really keen to understand some of those integration API updates each time those release notes drop. So the first one, and I think actually this wasn't in any particular order, but it's the one that's most exciting to me, because Salesforce really does a great job at bringing integration technologies into the platform in a way that doesn't mean you have to be a developer. And if you haven't heard of external services before, you basically point it to an existing API or service, so long as it's got a descriptor about what that API does and the data it can receive and send, known as an API spec or open API spec, then it will create and import that into your Salesforce environment. You can use it with Flow, Apex, and even Agentforce these days. So Salesforce has had this technology for quite a while, but what's different now in Winter 26 is we're not just generating easy access to the APIs as they exist. We're recognizing with this feature that some APIs return binary data or set or receive binary data. And binary data can be difficult to manage in Flow or in Apex because it can be voluminous, very large, go beyond the heap limits. So this is why Salesforce is really taking advantage of the fact that they're not here just bringing a sort of vanilla version of this particular API that you pointed external services at into the platform. They're really recognizing that, hey, we have a files tab or a files object here. And if it happens to detect there's some binary information being exchanged with the API, then what happens now as of Winter 26 is your files tab will be the recipient of those files automatically. And equally, if you want to send some files with an API, it will take the file information from the files tab. So this is great integration that developers or even Flow builders don't need to write or think about. It just automatically detects that there's binary information here and gives you the option to use the file integration. And of course, it's also excellent for high volume files. And obviously, some of the limitations of Apex make it particularly difficult with the heap limit the way it is to handle reasonably large files above, certainly above like 5 megabyte or so. So this new feature actually goes all the way up to 16 megabyte. Hopefully Salesforce will increase that even further over the coming releases, but this is a big leap forward and a simplification of how you can send and receive binary files or PDFs, images, whatever, using external services. So it's a big developer productivity boost as well, because I literally ended up writing some code the week before the release notes hit that was doing just this. I had to, I was sending a file record ID to a Heroku service, and I wrote some code that then called back to Salesforce to download the file and then read that. So I didn't really need to do all that code now, because it just marshals the binary data in and out of the file object, which is amazing. So I really love that feature. And I think from a testing point of view, obviously testing external APIs has a number of things to keep in mind in terms of how you're connecting to those and the security around those. But again, external services really manages a lot of that connectivity. And typically you would connect to a sandbox API of the service that you're using, not the live API that you're using. And for that matter, you would want to have file information in order to exercise this feature, and then check in the files tab afterwards whether or not those files have been received. It will need, I would imagine, some developer to come along and make sure that that service has got the binary qualifier in the descriptor in the open API. But if that's the case, then it's going to start using this feature. And I think it's important to be able to say, well, can my tests query the file object? Can you create files automatically? So I think my kind of main steer here is learn more about the file object. If you're using external services that is sending and receiving file or binary information, then and you want to leverage this, then make sure that your tooling understands the file object.
Yeah.
Fantastic. The next one is Lightning Out 2.0. So this is basically a technology that takes the investment that you'll have you create when you create a Lightning Web Component. So Lightning Web Component is a customized piece of user experience, a little button or a component, a grid or a tree or something of a significant level of complexity, even beyond sort of those examples, that exists on a page or a tab. And as a developer, we create these when the standard Salesforce UI doesn't do what we want. And the good news here is that sometimes that investment can be can be desirable to use that outside of Salesforce. Maybe you're building a partner portal to engage with your partners. and they don't have logins to Salesforce, but you want to take that new wonderful component that you've created for them. Maybe it's a dashboard component or something that helps them understand their role in terms of your ecosystem that you've expressed as a Lightning Web Component. And this technology lets you take that same code and use it in a website that's not running on Heroku, running on Salesforce. Maybe it's running in Heroku or some other web platform. So it's great investment to make sure that you don't just think about writing Lightning Web Components for inside Salesforce. You can now think about writing Lightning Web Components that also are reused outside of Salesforce in your portals and other websites. So maximizing your investment for Lightning Out. And I would say that the testing strategy side of things for this is very similar to what you're already doing for web testing right now. If you're using UTAM or Selenium or other web test frameworks, then testing this scenario is likely to be, in fact, I've just spotted a typo there. It's not called Lighting Out v2.0, it's called Lightning Out v2.0. But testing this is very similar in the way that you'd use Selenium or UTAM or other testing frameworks. I think the benefit, though, is that if you've already invested in teaching those test frameworks about a particular Lightning component that's already in Salesforce that you developed, then you can reuse those tests as well when it exists outside of Salesforce, because it's rendered and programmed exactly the same way. Obviously, the website around it is different. So I think from a tester's point of view, this is also good because it also means your tests can, the tests you've invested in for that particular component can also equally apply outside.
Yeah, Andrew, I would just push that point a little further, if I
Please.
may. So interestingly, let's say I have built out some UI test cases using UTAM, Selenium, a tool, AI, who knows. But now with the new system, let's say, we have new flows and new components and new classes and such.
Yes.
I am assuming that we would have to maintain those tests, rewrite some parts, maybe an XPath here, a class there, or not so much.
Well, it depends what the tests are focusing on. If you've modularized your tests such that you've created tests around the component when it's running in Salesforce, then largely that test, if it's modularized and isolated enough, that test configuration will just work the same way. The whole idea here is that the developed Lightning component works as it would normally inside Salesforce, but outside of Salesforce. So I think the same is true. Obviously, the code, the content around the component is different. The context is different. But I think the test and test code and the development code that you've created around this component can be reused. So that's why I think it's not just a feature for the code to run outside, but the test code to run against a website that has been developed outside of Salesforce. So I think the reusability here is really, really good. So again, I think providing you've written your test code in a modular way, I mean, typically, I haven't practiced a lot of web test development myself, but what I've seen in these frameworks is you can modularize it to say these tests are for this component, not the whole page. So if you're not doing that right now, then I think that's probably another recommendation, is to think about how you break down the tests to be more component driven.
Yeah, no, I think my key takeaway from this one is that as long as your tests are modularized and they're atomic in nature, it should be fine. But then what I've seen in the industry is that, again, just like how development happens in natural course, people just write at the page level and the whole end-to-end level. And that is where, again, just like tech debt, you start end up having test debt.
Yeah, and I think component level development is equally applicable to test development as well. So it is a good reminder to be component driven both in test and implementation.
Yeah, super.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
So the next one is the new GraphQL module, and arguably this is because it's replacing an existing feature. it's not really new, but it adds some new features along the way. So if you're not familiar with GraphQL, it is an industry standard, and think of it as a way of querying information from the database, but doing it instead of writing 10 queries, you might write one. And because relationships exist between the tables or your objects, you can ask for information to say, get me the accounts and the contacts or the opportunities and the line items and the quotes. So GraphQL is a technology that allows you to make very optimized requests for data to get a kind of, as it were, a graph, a structure of the data back. And what Salesforce have done here is implemented a new API for Lightning web developers to use. And this encourages them to use more dynamic support, which they didn't have before. So more optimal use. It's important when you're developing web clients to be optimal about the traffic. You know, these days we're all very used to having very high speed internet, and you don't probably see it when you use a website, but it still matters net, you know, for all the users on the planet and all the network to be very conscious of how much chat is going back and forth. So GraphQL is an awesome technology for reducing the noise across the line by making more concise requests for the data. And I would say from a test point of view, if you're already testing at the UI level, you're unlikely to be impacted or by this because it's an implementation detail. So I think, you know, it's a good one to be aware of, but I wouldn't necessarily think there's any change to your testing. That sort of depends on the type of testing. If you're doing UI testing, as I say, it's an implementation detail. But if you are doing performance testing, I think it's an opportunity perhaps to give some feedback to your engineering teams. If you're doing performance testing and you're noticing a lot of chat, you know, lots of requests, either it's retrieved the opportunity, then it retrieved the account, and then it retrieved some quotes, and it did those in discrete operations, then, you know, this is an opportunity to give some feedback as a test engineer, because, you know, that I think everybody has the right to provide feedback in whatever role you're in about how the products and features are working. So you can maybe be smart if you're going down to that sort of network level, particularly if you're doing performance testing, and look out for these opportunities and provide your engineering team, your organization opportunity to perhaps review that implementation and use this.
Yeah, 100%. Andrew, I'll just pause here for 10 seconds. We have a question on the LinkedIn Live chat. It says, so Uday asks, how does GraphQL impact the testing scripts? Is it for doing database validations?
It's an interesting question. So I think the test scripts themselves, if you're doing a UI test, it's really the test is interacting with the UI. And if the UI uses GraphQL or other query mechanisms, you don't see that. So it won't impact a UI test. But it's also interesting, and I think, I don't know if that's behind your question, if quite often when we do tests, we use other ways to assert the behavior. So in some cases, you might assert that a certain button appeared or a certain page appeared in your UI test to assert the functionality worked. But in other cases, you might go and run some database queries in your test code to determine whether it got the right information, was updated or created on the database. And I think, yes, I think there's an opportunity for you to be optimal about the queries that you're making to the database, and it would simplify arguably your test code to be able to make one API call and then assert on the entire graph the information that you're getting back, versus make lots of API database calls in your test code. So I hadn't really thought about that. So it's a good question. I think it does simplify your test code, particularly when asserting. It's only a read-only feature, but I think it does allow you to do database asserts in a more efficient manner.
Yeah, I think I love that answer, because it has given me a few ideas that rather than doing like 10 REST API calls, you can maybe like do 2-3 GraphQL calls and then just like make it faster and more compact.
Yeah, I mean, this feature is about LWC developers using GraphQL, but actually the API exists already, you know, for the back end. So yeah, great discussion. Yeah, I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Yeah.
This next one is again keeping with the theme of integration. And Salesforce have long been acquiring multiple clouds and products over the years. And obviously we're all familiar, hopefully, with MuleSoft. MuleSoft has a vast array of connectors that allows you to connect to different libraries, like different services, in this case, for example, Asana or Calendly, to avoid you having to take over the overhead of figuring out how to integrate with these systems. They just have built-in connectors. And so far, that has been accessible only if you're using MuleSoft directly. What's happening now in Winter is you can marry the value of Flow with the value of MuleSoft very directly. So normally we think about Flow as being something you can put on the UI or a trigger. There's Flow triggers, right, that run in the background when records are changed. And normally those are flows that are kind of used when you're doing things in Salesforce. And that's historically been the case. Flow's really only reacting to changes from the user or the system in Salesforce. What we're seeing now is that if you have an external system, you can also use your Flow skills to react to things from external systems. And this brings together really more of a unified experience for me from across Salesforce, because as a big company, they acquire many different products, and sometimes they can appear very siloed. And why should we not be able to use MuleSoft and Flow together? And that's perfect example of where I think Salesforce is finally bringing us what I like to call a single pane of glass, unified experience together. So, a real world use case for this might be if you're using Asana, which is a popular project management tool, and some of the tasks get completed with this technology, you can fire a Flow and execute those. Or if an event on Calendly gets accepted, then you can trigger a Flow. So it is very flexible. And if you're using Flow a lot and you have an interest in integrating with external systems, then this makes it very point and click as opposed to building code for those integrations. And with MuleSoft, you don't have to understand the APIs.
I'll actually keep my tester hat aside for 30 seconds. And this is one which I really loved. I've worked on half a MuleSoft project, and it's really tough to integrate and APIs and connectors and gateways and 20,000 other things. But I'm really excited to see that now you can just be a Flownotic and just do it through point and click.
Yeah, it's great. And it does require a MuleSoft license. So some of you might be sighing at this point, but obviously it doesn't, as we just saw with external services and other mechanisms, Salesforce does operate a spectrum of ways in which you can do things, which can be bewildering at times. But if you don't have a MuleSoft license, it's not impossible to link Flow with the external system. You just need to use some developer and architects skills and resources to do it. But I think if you happen to have MuleSoft and Salesforce and Flow skills, and you're obviously using MuleSoft already, then I think this is a great new enhancement. From a test perspective, I think the obvious question here is, how would you go about perhaps testing those flows? And flow testing I'll come on to a little bit later, because I've also highlighted an innovation that Salesforce has done with flow testing. But I think this is going to really require some form of mocking in terms of being able to generate mock examples of some of these services. And MuleSoft does have the ability to mock APIs and events there. So I think, your test surface area is going to get very complicated if you try and, test automate Asana or test automate Calendly. And you're not really there to test those things. But what you are there to test is that if something happens in Asana or Calendly, then eventually the flow gets invoked and maybe the flow updates a record. So I think I'd look to the features in MuleSoft that where it does mocking to allow you to simulate those things so that you can reduce the footprint of what you're actually having to set up in order to test these things. The other thing is that you can likely invoke the flows directly. I mean, some of these will be automatable flows, and you can invoke those using Apex or the command line There's lots of ways to invoke a flow. So if you didn't want to use mocking or simulations in MuleSoft, and you just assume that bit works, because at some point in your testing strategy you have to make a commitment to these things work or have a very low risk of breaking, then you can test the flows individually, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So I think the two options there for this would be to leverage some of the mocking capabilities in MuleSoft, or if you don't want to go that far, think about ways to just test the flow directly by just emulating the inputs into the flow.
Yeah, I think I've gone a little deep into how to actually test a flow, and what I've realized, Andrew, to your point, is that just treat it like a black box. Like you have an input and you have an output, and it should just match.
Yeah,
Then just forget everything. Like just forget like 2 kilometer long flow in the middle or 2 mile long flow in the middle, and just do the input output.
yeah, it is. It is code at the end of the day, and then people are like, "What? It's not code, it's flow," but it's logic. Logic has inputs and outputs, so I think it's a good
Yeah.
way of thinking about it. So let's just turn our attention to some of the features in the developer experience. I think what's really important to developers, and as test engineers, you're also developers, right? The inner loop is what's known as what's the thing you do the most often, and what's the most what can get the most painful if that gets slow or cumbersome. And usually it's writing test code, running test code, or writing code and running code. So that's called the inner loop. And what's happening here is that if I'm developing a Lightning Web Component, historically, if that component used some Apex logic, that wasn't accessible to me locally, I would have to deploy that Lightning component and test it in Salesforce. My inner loop suddenly goes from this to a little bit wider, and I'm sat there drumming my fingers waiting for deployments. So it's very welcome that Salesforce continues to invest in local development, because many other platforms other than Salesforce allow you to build on your own computer and test on your own computer and emulate, or even download databases and other things to run locally, and it's much more efficient. So I think from a test point of view, there is a technique where you can write tests with LWC. Most of the time you'll be mocking the Apex interactions there, but maybe there's a scenario where you're debugging something or wanting to understand how to develop a Lightning Web Component test. And in order to do that, you need to invoke the Apex controller. So I think this helps if you're writing LWC tests and understanding how to mock the Apex controllers, because you don't have to keep deploying the component to run the Apex controller. What will happen now is, even though it's running locally, it'll still run the Apex controller. It doesn't run Apex locally, unfortunately, folks. Don't get too excited. But it's really a good step forward to just keeping your development, whether it's test development or component development, local, while making sure that your Apex controllers still run. So yeah, cut down those tedious deploy refresh cycles. So I don't know how many people in the audience are building LWC tests, but I imagine at some point you've needed to mock those responses from the back end, and I think this is going to be useful to help you do that mocking. Good. Okay. Oops, and then he skipped over one there. This one I think will be very interesting. It gets us back to the topic of flow. Salesforce of a long time had a setup menu item, which I believe, and I remember, it's one of those things that you kind of take for granted, but I think used to say Apex test execution under the setup menu, and it's now changed to application test execution. And the reason why is because it no longer just runs Apex tests. If you've written flows it's only applicable to record triggered flows. So flows that run when you invoke and create a record or update a record. If you've created tests for those flows, then as you see on the screenshot here, it'll run those tests as well. So I think from a tooling point of view, many of you, or even those of you using third-party products, will have invested in reporting and analytics capabilities around the execution of Apex tests. And this is a good move by Salesforce, because it means that if you're also starting to invest in flow tests, that same reporting analytics approach, indeed the same UI here, has now suddenly got the ability to run and report on the flow test in the same place using the same APIs. So I think it's really a good recognition from Salesforce that logic is logic, whether it's flow, no code logic, or it's Apex code, and we need the same sort of test lens across the two. So I was really pleased to see that. So I think, the impact here is, if you're not using flow tests, take a look at them. They aren't as wide coverage as I think we'd all like, but I think it's a good step in the right direction if you're using record level flow tests. And I think it might be an extra way of enticing you to give it a go if you haven't, knowing that you can now see the results in the same way you've seen Apex.
Yeah, I will just ask one question, I think, from the audience. The question is, can the test scripts capture flow debug logs and provide additional details when a test fails? Also, how does this work for screen flows compared to auto-launched flows?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, the first question was debug logs. For flow logs go in the same place as Apex logs. So when you're running the tests, you're also seeing the debug log is basically the system debug log. Often it's called the Apex debug log, but really it's got all sorts of other information in it, including your flow debug. If you switch the right filter levels on when you're running them, then you'll see all of the logic, all of the log entries, whether it's Apex test output or whether it's flow. So that's kind of the first question, was use the existing logging mechanisms, you'll see it. The second question is, can you use it with UI flows and automation flows? The answer appears to be no right now. I did take another look at it this morning, and the test UI in Flow Builder is only bound to flow types that are connected with kind of record level operations, so creating and updating records. Hopefully they'll expand it. The one thing I would say is that if you've written automatable flows, which are basically, as I think Robin was pointing out earlier, just black boxes, parameters go in, data comes out. You actually have been, for a very long time now, been able to run flows like that from an Apex test. So if you're familiar with Apex, you can write Apex to test flow, if that makes sense. So and therefore it would appear in this view. So just because Salesforce doesn't have a point and click way for automatable flows, you can still do it with Apex. The UI side of things, to some degree, I would imagine you could do that, but the problem is you're not running the UI or the browser in the test. So I think it's probably more likely. I've never tried it with a UI test, because you can invoke UI tests from Apex too. Sorry, UI flows, but that's usually in a UI context. I suspect Salesforce will block UI flows from running in an Apex test context.
Yeah.
So for your second question, it's a kind of half yes to automation flows, but I think it's probably a definitive no for UI flows.
Okay, fair. Thank you.
Of course, UI flows can be tested through UI testing as well, so you can get at them that way. This next one is useful. I think there's probably very little interest. I mean, saying that, it depends on the tests you're writing. Robin and I were talking in our prep call here about the test triangle, and there's unit tests, system tests, and you've kind of got your critical tests right at the top. And if you're doing a lot of unit tests, whether you're an engineer, because it is good practice for engineers to write the unit tests, or you're augmenting the engineers or writing unit tests just solely as what your role is, then having good documentation about the units, the code, the classes that you're writing is important. And what Salesforce have done here in Winter is you'll be familiar with commenting code, of course, but there is a syntax, an actual syntax that makes it machine readable, and that allows you to generate HTML in a certain format, documentation about the code. So I think the more insight you can get on the code when you're writing unit tests to that Apex code, the better. So hopefully the adoption of this means you'll start to see more developers perhaps even including yourself, because your test code can use this as well. If it's Apex test code, then you just have another lens in which to document what the code is doing, and that helps everybody. And I mentioned AI here. It's just not a kind of just for the sake of it, but the more documentation you put in your code, whether it's test code or implement or production code, the better AIs can help with parsing that code and even writing some of it. So I think it's a great thing that Salesforce has done here to formalize how Apex documentation works. Okay, I think this is the last one, and this is about dependency management. And this is kind of potentially a little bit niche. Definitely, if you're an ISV test engineer, test automation person, then you'll know what a package is. If you don't, a package is way of ultimately, as the name suggests, a way of packaging all of the code, custom fields, objects, Lightning components into a virtual package, if you like, and then you're doing that to distribute that solution. And the reason why it's not mostly synonymous with ISVs is because you're packaging your app to distribute on App Exchange for other client customers to install in their environment. Internally, over the years, Salesforce has been encouraging, even if you're not an ISV, you're building a lot of code in your Salesforce environment. And historically, it's just been a flat jumble in some cases of just code. And packaging allows you to modularize your Salesforce environment so that you can focus on certain changes and leave others alone. So packaging is a really good way of modularizing and distributing code, whether you're an ISV or not. And when things get more advanced with packaging, you might have common things in a package and then other packages dependent on that. And what Salesforce have done here is just made packaged dependency management a great deal easier, because as it is with other package management solutions on other platforms, it will figure out if you have a depth of packages. Package A is dependent on B is dependent on C, and D and E. Then it's kind of cognitively hard to keep all that tree of dependencies in your head. So really, basically, they're saying, oh, you just have to remember A depends on B. Don't worry about what B depends on, which I think is great for accuracy. I think as a test engineer, it can be complicated if you've got a lot of packages, and sometimes you might see a bug or build some tests based on a certain set of versions of all of these things, and mistakes can be made without auto dependency management. And I think this just helps minimize those mistakes and maybe false positives in your tests because somebody deployed the wrong version of something. So I think it's a very good modern approach forward for Salesforce to do dependency management, because those can be some of the hardest things to track down from a test failure perspective.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll finish up with this. Robin contacted me to come and join this session because I'd been blogging about this. So if you're interested in more details, my blog, AndyInTheCloud.com, is available, and I have gone through a few more other things in that blog as well. Over to you, Robin.
Awesome. Thank you. I will come to the surprise speaker bit, but first and foremost, mega thanks to Andrew for not just the blogging parts, but accepting our invite for this inaugural episode. I would highly recommend the curious ones to go to Andy's blog. That is where we found some of these jewels and nuggets of wisdom, and found that we really, really need to do a deep dive on some of these items. See, when you get a 300-page release note, Winter 26, and you make yourself a large cup of coffee, or you maybe just feed your release notes into ChatGPT and ask it. It is rare that you will find something meaningful, but thanks to Andy, the blogs, and the expert notes, we have a deeper understanding of what's new and what's exciting, and then obviously what it all means for the QA and engineers. So once again, thanks a ton, Andy, for walking us through this.
To the rest of the community, I'm not alone in blogging about this, and I focused a lot on the technical things, but if you search, you'll find admin related highlights around Winter 26 as well. So, I think it's a great community that we all jump on these, hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of release notes and help simplify it. So thank you for asking me to join.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so as promised initially, we have a small snippet from another guest speaker, Dimitri Fiuli, who is the founder at Springburst. So if Andy please goes to the next one, a small video.
3 times a year, Salesforce changes your Salesforce org, whether you ask for it or not. Hi, everyone. I'm Dimitri Fiole, the founder of Springburst. With the Winter 25 release upon us, I want to talk about the impact those 3 annual releases have on both production and ongoing projects. One of the things we all value about Salesforce is that it keeps evolving. Every release brings new features, smart automation, and opportunities to deliver more value. That is a huge part of why the platform is so powerful. But with that pace of innovation comes responsibility. It is not just about what Salesforce adds, it is about how those changes ripple through your Salesforce org. And that is where testing has to step up. When a new release is rolled out, it first lands in your preview sandboxes. That gives you the opportunity to test and see how the changes affect your setup. And a few weeks later, the same release is pushed into your production Salesforce org. That means you carry 2 responsibilities at once, validating that your live business processes will keep working and making sure your project work in sandboxes is not disrupted by the changes. If you have custom automations, integrations with other systems, or industry-specific processes, the risk multiplies, and sometimes a small field change or a tweak in flow behavior can break a process that feels critical to your users. Too often, we see teams separate these 2 worlds. They do a quick smoke test after the release hits their preview sandbox and then go back to project work. But Salesforce does not wait for your timeline. The cadence keeps moving, and if you treat the release cycle as background noise, issues show up in 2 places at once. Frustrated users in production and blocked developers in your project team. So what can you do differently? Over the years, we found 3 practices that really work. 1, baseline regression packs. Start with your most critical business processes and automate them. That gives you the ability to validate in hours and not in weeks. 2, parallel validation in preview sandboxes. This is a game changer. By running these regression packs in preview, you get a clear view of how the release impacts production and development before it even goes live. 3, unified release calendar. Treat Salesforce's release schedule as part of your project plan and build your test cycles around it. Do not plan in isolation, plan with the cadence in mind. What makes Salesforce different from other platforms is that you cannot opt out. The release train will not stop. It keeps moving 3 times a year, whether you're ready for it or not. That is a gift and a challenge. A gift because you get constant innovation, and a challenge because you cannot just stand still. You have to adapt your testing approach to stay in sync. If you build your QA with that rhythm in mind, you keep your production Salesforce org stable and your projects moving forward. It is not just about testing what you build, it is about testing with Salesforce itself. And that mindset shift makes all the difference. Thanks for listening. And now back to you, Robin.
Super awesome. Thank you so much, Dimitri and Andrew. I think we are bang on time. So thanks a bunch for our lovely audience and the tough questions that we got. I fear that we won't be having a lot of more time for Q&A. We'll end this over here, but then Andy and Robin and the community is here to answer any questions.
Yeah, please find us on LinkedIn. And yeah, thank you for your questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Andy. You have a nice day. Thanks to the audience for being with us. Have a nice one and happy release. Bye bye for now.